Thank you all for inviting me to join you. Again, my name is Doug Arseneault. I'm with Alta Planning and Design. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with our firm, but we're the preeminent active transportation firm in the U.S. I work specifically on our innovative mobility team, which includes topics like micromobility. I'm a hyper specialist in shared e-scooters and other forms of micromobility and looking at policy considerations. But I work closely with our design team as well, and our folks that do work all around the country and really across North America. So I'm going to dive into talking a little bit about micromobility first, and then speak to kind of the idea of setting some principles. Some of this was incorporated into the Bay Area, trail guidelines, design guidelines that were recently published that Alta worked on. But I'm going to speak to specifically some design considerations as you all are looking at building out the Bay Area Trail, expanding it, as well as some policy and management considerations for those of you in the public sector. So let's first talk about micromobility. Sam touched on this a little bit, but micromobility overall, we're really talking about small, fully or partially human-powered vehicles. So bicycles, scooters, skateboards, roller skates, other self-balancing, vehicles like one wheels and such. But then specifically, we're going to be speaking today about powered micromobility, which are still low speed. I'm going to speak into some of the speed controls around powered micromobility, but generally we're talking about e-bikes and e-scooters, that have some amount of, electric power that's motorizing them, but also keeping them, from necessarily reaching the sort of speeds that we're dealing with cars and other things. In the state of California, we have three classes of electric bicycles. We have class ones, which are mainly pedal-based, things we generally would call electric assist or e-assist, and those are maxed out under state law at 20 miles per hour. I'm going to speak a little bit around shared micromobility, but the shared vehicles are often even capped a little lower than that, from a safety standpoint. There's no minimum age to ride a class one vehicle or class two, which I'll speak about in just a moment, but there are helmet laws, of course, in place for youth 17 and under. Class two are vehicles that also are capped at 20 miles an hour, but will generally have a throttle to assist with starting and ending the trip itself, a motor that's built in to get folks on their way. But I think what's really important about class two, as they have grown in popularity, is they're still capped out at 20 miles an hour. So, we're generally speaking about vehicles that are not going, much faster than that. We're not talking about mopeds or anything that's really at a higher, speed level. And then finally, we have class three. These are also electric assist, but allow for moving up to 28 miles per hour. Most vehicles in California are really class one and class two. Class three vehicles are fairly rare, but are allowed on public streets. We generally don't see them much on trails, although under state law, they are permitted. So again, these can go up to 28 miles an hour, and there is a minimum age to ride these vehicles at 16. So no children are really allowed to ride these vehicles that are higher than the 20 miles an hour. And then, of course, helmet laws are in place for riding any sort of class three electric bike. Like, why are we talking about e-micromobility right now? Data just came out that 15% of the US population now own an e-bike. And a lot of this growth in e-bike use or ownership really grew during the pandemic as folks were looking at opportunities to get outside and to move around, particularly in open air opportunities, get some exercise. And just as of a few weeks ago, there was a report that came out that said now worldwide, 49% of electric vehicles are e-bikes compared to EVs. Now, to put this into perspective somewhat, a lot of the e-bike use is coming out of China, where e-bikes are particularly popular, but in places like the Bay Area, we're seeing a lot of growth also in e-bike use and ownership. And then, shared micromobility has also grown exponentially. This is my specialty. We now have 133 million shared micromobility trips last year. So despite the drop during the pandemic, we're now reaching similar levels, and we expect here in 2024 to reach or even exceed those pre-pandemic levels. Cities like Portland have expanded their fleets to allow up to 15,000 e-scooters and e-bikes on public streets. So we're seeing a huge growth in many markets around shared micromobility. And shared micromobility has, again, increased by 20% just between 2022 and 2023. So we hit, the peak was 136. We're looking at 133 just last year. And dockless e-bikes have now increased to nearly 50% of that. While e-scooters were and continue to be very popular, we are seeing dockless e-bikes growing as a percentage of the shared micromobility. And that's particularly true here in the Bay Area. We've seen e-bike usage through Bay Wheels to dramatically expand, particularly as more electric bikes have been made available through Lyft and the Bay Wheel system. So, shared micromobility is increasingly a way that folks are getting around. And so we want to make sure that there's opportunities to consider what these impacts are and what are the opportunities for the Bay Area Trail. And so why support having powered micromobility on trails? First and foremost, e-bikes and electric scooters provide an equitable and affordable transportation option. Particularly when we're looking at low-income populations, people of color, and people with disabilities, electric vehicles provide opportunities to, counter some of the limitations that traditional bicycles, traditional pedal bicycles can have. They're also more competitive with cars, with automobiles, due to the ability to use them, the higher ease of using them. And so when we're talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, really, and looking at mode shift, electric micromobility provides a really great opportunity to match some of those statewide goals and regional goals through the Bay Area Council and others, and MTC. And it's really about expanding the number and type and demographics of folks that are able to travel by active transportation. And so as there's higher adoption, we also want to make sure that there's infrastructure that can support these ways, because folks are adopting them and we want to make sure that they do so safely. And it's also about improving health outcomes. Yes, the powered micromobility is not necessarily as as much of an exercise tool as a traditional bike, but we still find that it provides an opportunity to reach some amount of moderate physical activity. So, from a public goal standpoint, from a health standpoint, and really from an equity standpoint, powered micromobility really provides a huge opportunity, particularly on the Bay Trail. And so this is really about expanding the range of individuals' ability to move and to attract more folks to trails by determining how shared use paths like the Bay Area Trail can safely function and safely serve all the different types of users that are traveling along the corridors. So now I want to talk about some myths that have popped up around micromobility, particularly powered micromobility. One of them is that Bay users don't want to share. We've actually found, based on surveys, that communities prefer more etiquette strategies rather than outright prohibiting access. So it's really about how are we managing behavior, how are we educating folks on operating vehicles, and also educating the broader community about the opportunities around using powered micromobility. Another one is that e-powered users are just simply going too fast, when in fact we have found consistently that e-bike users ride at the same speed or even slower than folks riding traditional bikes. As we're looking at expanding out access to cycling, e-bikes provide a great opportunity. And so as we have more folks using e-bikes, we also find that they're more hesitant, and they will operate under the guidelines and the etiquette that is put into place. The other factor here is also, as we attract more people, it provides an opportunity to manage overall use. When there's more people operating, there's also the opportunity to prevent some of these bad users, I suppose. And speaking to that is that there's this myth that e-bike users or e-scooter users can be reckless, when in fact there have been evaluations, including in Fort Collins, that found that e-bike users are often even more courteously behaved compared to those using traditional bikes. The traditional cyclists that are super users. Here we have expanding opportunities to really access these types of vehicles. And then there's the concern around crashes. And while we don't have data that really looks at differentiating between those using e-bicycles and e-scooters relative to traditional bikes or even push scooters, there isn't any strong indication from on the national level or even on the regional level that we are seeing significantly more crashes. Of course, there are exceptions to this. There are possibility of bad crashes, but overall, we're not seeing major trends that they create issues on trails. So let's talk about what now. What are opportunities for the Bay Area Trail and as trail development is happening? And so it's really about coming from a principle standpoint, which I'm going to speak a little deeper into, but really getting clear on what are the goals of the community, what are the goals of the trail, particularly as the Bay Trail is looking at expanding access for commuting. E-bikes provide and e-scooters provide an opportunity to expand use of the trail, and then really looking at who the trail is looking to serve and how we can manage the various users of the trail. Policy and management options are also important pieces. Looking at who, what, where, when, how folks are moving along trails, and really determining how to best manage different segments of the trail to work to serve all of these users. And education is such an important piece here, particularly around etiquette, around making sure that everyone can feel safe traveling along the trail. That being said, we can only do so much to put the responsibility onto users. It's really about looking at what is the design of the trail and ensuring that some of these design considerations are put into place, which I'm also going to speak into in just a few moments. So let's talk about some of the principles. First and foremost, we're talking about mobility justice. Again, powered micromobility provides really an opportunity for folks to travel longer distances, to compete with vehicles, travel faster, and also provides opportunity for folks of a wider range of abilities. When we're talking about particularly communities of color and other marginalized communities, there's a huge opportunity to expand access to the trails and really centering these communities in the planning and design process, so that the trail is being developed in a way that works for all users. So, we're really looking at how are we making decisions around the trail and how e-micromobility can really feed into that. Safety has got to be a centerpiece of this. And of course, you all work closely on ensuring that there's safe travel, but always we're looking at how do we prioritize the most vulnerable users, which in many cases is pedestrians and folks that are possibly using it for, recreational uses. And so accounting for design features that can improve the safety for pedestrians and other vulnerable users, and looking at some design features like turning radii, signage placement, limits on speed is a major consideration and a great opportunity. And making sure that the maintenance of the trail is in place and ensuring that anything are repaired, because of course, when folks are traveling at higher speeds, there's a greater risk from a safety standpoint of more severe crashes when the trail isn't maintained. So maintenance is a major aspect of this. There's also as neighborhood electric vehicles have grown in popularity, there's a possibility to warrant physical separation. I'm looking at designating lanes on the trail for certain speed vehicles. And that's where, electric micromobility can provide kind of the median between push pedal and some of these higher speed electric vehicles, but really about looking at what are the volumes and figuring out where separation makes sense or doesn't make sense. And then, of course, designating areas where maybe there's no powered vehicles, and using things like geofencing, particularly for shared vehicles, to do some of the speed controls. And of course, all trails must complement the natural environment. So as we're looking at ensuring access for multimodal, powered micromobility, it's really centering that user experience and ensuring that the natural environment can shine. So some design features here are places, expanded parts of the trail for things like bird watching, or thinking about sound and speed restrictions. Again, how do we ensure that the trail can complement the natural environment? And prioritizing that human experience, really coming from a do no harm approach of design modifications, management policies that really prioritize those most vulnerable users. And so as we're looking at future ready trails, including the Bay Trail, there's really opportunities to educate and ensure that both design features and the management principles are there, so that the level of comfort is maintained and can expand as there's more users on the trails. Along with this, it's ensuring that the user amenities are there. Things like charging stations, are important for access to e-micromobility, but just amenities overall, ensuring that places at trailheads can accommodate things like larger bikes, which e-bikes tend to be larger and heavier. So, looking at places to look at parking, also looking at maps and signage that can dictate where electric micromobility is operating, and other forms of micromobility are operating along the trail, so that everyone is aware of the various users that are in that area. So, and then finally, it's really about future proofing. And there's a range of tools included in the trail guidelines, as well as some reports that we've put out around how trail designers and managers can really track trends and identify how user groups and demographics are shifting, ongoing efforts to conduct research and looking at how the trail can adapt as there's an expanding typologies and demographics that are using it, and really understanding the latent demand, so that trails are being developed in a way that provides effective design solutions that can ensure that the Bay Area Trail is really able to operate long into the future. So again, we're talking about advancing mobility justice. We're talking about designing for safety, complementing the natural environment, prioritizing that human experience, expanding amenities, and then, of course, future-proofing, which I know you all are working very diligently on ensuring that the Bay Trail can meet all of these needs. And so with that, I'm going to talk a little about some of the design features. Width is a major one that we talk about. Width, surface type, and adjacent space, so that various users are able to travel and feel, and not only feel safe, or not are safe, but also feel safe. And so while the trail can range and how much space is available, it's really about figuring out what is possible, because we have so many different user types that are increasingly using trails, right? Pedestrians, we have runners who are traveling at higher speeds, wheelchair users, and other folks using mobility assistance devices. The casual and new cyclists who may be a little wary of how they're traveling, are super cyclists who are, experienced and may have used the trail one way, that is evolving as we're seeing more users and more types of vehicles moving along it. And then even between electric bike riders and e-scooter riders, different age demographics that are using the trail, it's really important to look at how these various, micromobility and active transportation uses are being utilized. And then with the, the expansion of things like neighborhood electric vehicles, figuring out where and what size trails need to be in order to accommodate all of these users. And so when we're looking at safe operating lists, we're really talking about riding space, passing space, and also ensuring there's extra width to accommodate some of the wider vehicles and passing. So with that, speaking to when to separate users, it's really about how many folks are using the trail itself and the various speeds. Of course, powered micromobility are sometimes traveling faster than others. We have newer users that are using them. And so depending on the space that's available, it's about thinking of where users can really operate in a safe place. So, when we're talking about the most traditional trails that are more narrow, 8 to 12 feet, we're really looking at places where there's kind of a low volume of folks traveling. The more traditional trails of 12 to 16, that's where we start looking at where are powered micromobility users going, and making sure that etiquette and education is a major factor there. As we get wider, we have spaces for accommodating slower folks that are moving along, and really looking at higher volume folks and accommodating that space. And then when we're looking at shared use paths, this is less true of trails, but more for the shared use paths. Class 1 for us planners. We're really looking at how do we look at really wide trails that can accommodate all these various users. Some other things to think about is intersections and driveways, places where there's conflict zones, essentially, ensuring that there's some safe and maneuverable spaces at these key locations. Smooth surfaces. This gets back to maintenance considerations, but also ensuring that as powered micromobility users are traveling, that there are safe ways to move along. As many of you, and riding micromobility, using bikes or scooters, hitting something like a pothole can be much more serious. So, ensuring that smooth surfaces exist. Signage and education is such a major aspect that we talk about, ensuring that folks are aware of who's traveling along the trail, and ensuring awareness exists, particularly as trail use shifts, as we're shifting from recreational into commuting. Paveway markings can be another great way of communicating with trail users, and really about creating a connected network of trails, which I know you all are working on. And so now I'm going to speak a little into the policy and management considerations. Part of it is looking at trail classifications, really thinking about user behavior, both current and what that latent demand looks like. And then, of course, a lot of what we're speaking to today around the user types and devices. So around trail classification, it's rare that a single trail type can accommodate all users. So it's really about thinking about establishing what are the appropriate use cases along the trail, how to manage use, how to design. Again, design and policy really goes hand in hand. I'm thinking about user behavior. So we really speak more into regulating the concern rather than the device, right? We want to look at how do we regulate the users and ensure that there are safe ways and coming from the kind of the good user, if you will, while also protecting against some of the challenges that bad users can create. So regulating the concern, getting really specific on what the challenge is, rather than just creating these blanket bans on the device itself, because that ultimately will reduce the amount of folks that are using the trail, and also force them to use paths that may not make as much sense, where trails provide a really great opportunity to move folks through the region. So here we're talking about speed, we're talking about access, again, parking considerations, noise and air pollution. So really it's about regulating the user behavior itself. So a few case studies that we've looked at is, in Vancouver, we found there were very minimal differences in speeds between traditional bicycles and e-bicycles, only about 2.5 miles per hour faster. We actually found that traditional bike users move on average at a higher speed than e-bikes. Part of this is that we have many new users who are a little more cautious about how they're traveling along a corridor. So we looked at some work in Fort Collins, for instance. adhering to speed limits. We're really talking about electric micromobility, and while there have been concerns about folks speeding, it's actually very minimal from what we've observed. It's pretty rare that we have folks that are engaging in unsafe speeding behavior. Many users are operating within current guidelines and also respond well to new guidelines that come into place. We find actually that, again, traditional cyclists tend to travel faster than or exceed the speed limits, while there are most e-micromobility users are traveling within the posted signs. So in Pinellas County, we saw this in Vancouver, Fort Collins. We've seen it around the country, around North America. E-bike users are also more likely to give audible signals and to abide by kind of etiquette. They're also more likely to provide more feet of passing because of their awareness of the higher speed that's possible. In fact, there's been 0 incidents that we have seen, at least in Fort Collins, where folks were creating conflicts between those walking and biking. Ironically, the only mode of transportation where we saw more conflict was with folks riding more traditional bicycles. So we're really looking at how do we create trails that can abide by the various user types. And so thinking about, from a management standpoint, who these users are, what their needs, what their demands are, and setting policies, messaging, signage, really telling folks where they belong and how they can operate safely. So trail policy, can allow for various forms of traveling, but specifically in California, there's local authorities are not allowed to ban e-bicycles on bike paths. So this is really why it's important to think about these considerations. So there have been some, particularly speed restrictions that have been very successful. Putting into place some reduced speed zones was very successful in Atlanta along the Beltline. It resulted in fewer complaints. And while some of the shared e-scooter companies reported some costs and time factors, overall there was a very negligible effect on those. And in fact, it created more opportunities for folks to use trails, including the very successful Beltline. So in terms of kind of future, learning more about the work that we do and some opportunities here, we put out a report called Next Generation Trails a few years ago that really dives into how to regulate these e-micromobility and other forms of micromobility along trails. And then we collaborated with NACDO on developing out the designing for small things with wheels. My colleague up in Portland, Derek Abe, helped lead that working paper. And so there are many opportunities to continue the conversation, and I'm happy to address any questions. And thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you, Doug. Really appreciate that presentation. That was very good. I'd like to open it up for people to ask questions to Doug. And we have 15, 20 minutes actually to accommodate people's questions.
I can start. I have a question, couple questions. Thought it was, can you hear me also?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just like around kind of early in your presentation, you mentioned I think it was AB 1096 on like, speeds and helmet wearing, and just generally around like the case study of etiquette. It seems like fairly clear that you're going to get maybe more, etiquette and safety issues more with bikers in lycra and spandex versus people on e-bikes. And in terms of like bans or regulations, have you seen any issues with like maybe a trail similar, like the Bay Trail that goes through many jurisdictions that might have a different regulation on like whether or not e-bikes are allowed or if they have different speed limits? Has that come up at all?
Not so much. I mean, it really has been about thinking through as part of the design and also some of the management principles. The speed restrictions have been really successful in ensuring that there's both perceived and actual safety maintained on trails. So we haven't seen across the country, we haven't seen, a lot of overall concerns. A lot of it has been based on overall fear of new types of vehicles operating on trails. But in fact, there have been very minimal impacts. And part of that is making sure that there are policy and design factors that are put into place when developing these trails and managing them. So it's a little proactive, and it's also about just there haven't been a major concerns in any that we've seen. Happy to answer their questions. I don't see if I can.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, I'm Sean Dugan. I work for the East Bay Regional Park District. Thanks for the presentation. I was a little late, but one of the I think the great thing about having a commercial company operate scooters, e-scooters, for instance, in public spaces is that you can limit, through geofencing their speed and everything. But what we're finding is a lot of private owner scooters that go however fast they want, wherever they want. I'm wondering if these studies that you shared, address how to. I mean, we could put up speed limit signs until we're blue in the face, but we're still getting a ton of complaints. And the perception is that things are going faster and that we're pushing slower moving users off these, narrow 10 foot, wide, narrow spaces in cases. So I don't know if you want, it's just harder to manage the private use. So I just wondering if you have any thoughts on that, or if there's anything in these studies that could kind of help guide the park district in coming up with some policies or managing the trail.
Sure. I mean, again, a lot of the speed restrictions have been fairly successful in controlling it. We've often heard, reports of the perception that vehicles are going faster because they are still capped at 20 miles per hour. Unless folks are bringing in, vehicles from out of state or, are sort of breaking those caps. But really any vehicle that's sold in California, any scooter is limited to 20 miles per hour. We haven't seen in any of these case studies where there have been major changes, but a lot of it is about educating folks and ensuring that there's proper signage and communication around it. Again, it's also about, in some cases, looking at, are there opportunities to expand the trail, or rather than expanding it necessarily, using paveway markings to provide opportunities to dedicate, where folks that are moving at higher speeds, can travel. The irony is that we've seen a lot of, some of these with traditional cyclists moving at faster rates. And I think because e-scooters particularly are kind of a newer technology, or at least are growing in number, there's more of a perception than, folks actually having challenges. But of course, there are cases where folks are, being irresponsible. But really it's about how do we design it in a way that can separate those users when needed, but generally, educating folks and ensuring that there's opportunities to, work collaboratively around it, right? There's the efforts around share the road. Some of that is, can translate into trails and sharing the trail.
Thanks, Doug.
Sure.
I have another quick question. And
Sure.
Sean mentioned it as well, or said the word geofencing, and I actually haven't heard of that before. Is that something that's in use right now as a method to separate, e-users from traditional users?
Yes, it's very popular to use geofencing. And many of the private companies, which I work fairly closely with, Lime and some of the other companies, Bird to a certain degree, they are very open to having these conversations and working collaboratively with the public sector to ensure that folks are traveling safely, because it's ultimately a win-win or a lose-lose if these considerations aren't in place. So geofencing has become really popular, and geofencing technology specifically has advanced dramatically as part of the growth of e-scooters and seeing more of them traveling. Lyft has been a good partner in a lot of this, with their e-bikes growing in popularity. But particularly with scooters, a lot of the companies have been really open to talking about how we make sure that folks can travel safely. Because there's, of course, concern about bans on using trails, and as trails, particularly the Bay Trail, becomes a kind of workhorse of the transportation network. There are massive opportunities to use technology to really ensure that folks, particularly less experienced folks that are using shared scooters, can operate safely and know where they're supposed to operate.
Doug, I have a question. This is Clarissa from Silicon Valley Bike Coalition. So recently, one of the cities in San Mateo County, Burlingame, they were discussing banning e-bikes, and mostly in city parks, but the Bay Trail was another that they, removed from whatever policy they ended up adopting. I wasn't watching it too closely, but I do think that there's some of the smaller cities where these micromobility devices are new, and the fear of or perception that they're moving faster. So I have kind of two questions in terms of etiquette, because I loved your presentation in breaking down like what's really happening on these trails versus the perception of what's happening. I would love to be able to grab some of that data and present it to the cities that are, likely to follow suit, because, what one city does, they start copying when, for example, council members are getting nuisance complaints.
Sure.
Are there great examples of teaching better etiquette on trails? Because it seems to be a point of education, but I wonder if anyone has modeled that for us, whether it's in the Bay or elsewhere. And then the latter question I had was, I'm starting to see folks really not like the e-bikes that are actually motorbikes.
Yeah.
And that tends to be the crux of why they want to ban, because those are truly like motorcycles, and they ought not be operating on trails. But the piece that I want to tease out there is a lot of times it's Black and brown youth that are riding these fun motorcycles, if you will. And I fear that a lot of them are trying to enact policies, but they're really pretextual stop kind of policies. And I say that knowing that it might be different city to city, but my big fear is that it's just like blasting your music while you're riding your bike. It's another reason for the cops to stop you. How do we educate cities and the public, because we're losing sight of the ultimate goal of reducing auto dependency?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start with your second question. Part of it is really educating our elected leaders about what is an e-bike and what some of the uses are. We have seen a large growth, particularly of youth of all, of all ethnicities, of, all income levels. It's about regulating their it's about where folks are traveling and ensuring that the elected officials are clear on what constitutes an e-bike, and so that there's better legislation over the types of vehicles that are allowed on some of these, particularly trails. When we're talking about e-bikes, we're really just talking about those three classes of things that are not mopeds, right? Anything that has a throttle that goes above 20 miles an hour is not an e-bike. And so it really doesn't belong on a trail particularly, and really is moving more, into the street. But part of it is, an infrastructure challenge, right? We're quick to, from a policy standpoint, many, city councils are quick to, ban the vehicle rather than regulate the behavior, and also, rethink the infrastructure and where, there's more dedicated places for folks to travel. One of the things that has gained popularity, and I'm not remembering exactly the city, but it's really working with the police department around educating them and ensuring that there are materials that are available to youth, and even incorporating discussions around e-bikes and some of these electric micromobility into things like driver's ed, and how these vehicles, which many Gen Alpha and Gen Z folks are using, to ensure that there's education on how to operate the vehicle properly, and where to operate, and complying with a lot of the etiquette and rules of the road. So there's a piece of educating elected officials. There's also a piece of educating the users themselves. And of course, kids are kids, right? There's going to be some irresponsibility, and so it's making sure that we are regulating those bad users, while also ensuring that there's still access for those folks that are traveling safely. In terms of examples of specific policies, I don't have one that's coming to mind that I've seen that has really done a great job of regulating electric micromobility. Again, a lot of this is, particularly as we're seeing more shared micromobility happening, is working with the companies to ensure that there's greater safety. And I think what's really important is working with police departments also on ensuring that there are some youth that are using shared micromobility that are underage. You generally need to be 18, have a credit card in order to have access. We see examples of youth that are riding multiple people on a scooter that provide issues. And so a lot of this is working with the folks that are enforcing some of the rules, and also ensuring that the rules are clear on what constitutes unsafe behavior, because in many cases folks are riding on sidewalks that it's not allowed, but the infrastructure may not accommodate. So it's a lot of education pieces that are available, and that's where I think the emphasis needs to go, and where we've seen some good results around it, rather than, again, we're big on regulate the user behavior rather than necessarily regulate the vehicle itself. Any other questions?
Yes. Hi, I'm Leo Bizard. I'm an intern at the Office of Supervisor Sackett, and I was just, you mentioned that bikes going faster than the speed limit. Where does that tend to happen in your data?
I mean, it happens kind of across the board. Part of it is we see folks are often observed going over the speed limit in places where there just isn't a lot of use. And so as we're expanding the number of people that are operating, that actually can help to, improve reducing the amount of folks that are speeding. So we see it in sectors that maybe don't have great visibility, are challenges. And so it really is about ensuring that there's, signage has been really successful in mitigating some of those concerns, just awareness of traveling, and, more on the, the shared micromobility, that's, kind of easier to regulate. Individual users, it's a fair amount about educating and also providing sufficient space for folks that are traveling.
So that happens on areas where there's no one going there. Is that, did I understand that correctly? That where
Yeah,
people
in
speed
places
is where there's
where,
not many people.
right.
So,
In places
but
where,
but then when there's more people, that doesn't happen.
right, because there's just simply not enough space for people to be speeding.
Yeah.
And so, we're not observing a lot of, folks that are speeding in areas where there's sufficient, trail users. And again, it's about how do we improve etiquette and educate folks on how to, share the trail.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leo.
Doug,
Yeah,
I
I'm
have
gonna-
a, oh,
Yeah, let me
sorry.
just throw this out. This is Michael from Hayward Area Rec and Park District. So
Michael.
I was just in Fort Collins, and so I get that the study is coming from there, but that's in some sense it's kind of like Davis. There's information and it's informative, but typically, especially here in the East Bay, I can't speak to Peninsula and San Francisco. I can have some knowledge, but it's kind of different. The constraints that we have here are a little different than Davis or Fort Collins. And so like just the issues of space, we do have more people on narrower trails typically when we can build them. We're looking to build out as many trails as we can, but they typically are narrower. So we kind of have that, condition of narrowest trails with more people trying to use them kind of in between different jurisdictions. So kind of various regulations, in place. And I guess that's why I'm glad to hear from Sean, because I was going to put Sean or Suzanne on the spot, and just from their standpoint, they addressed a lot of this stuff at through East Bay Regional Park District. They've done some studies and they've seen a lot of, a range of things that can happen. So it's good to have their input. And maybe just as BATSI, this is one of the topics that we may need to look at. Maybe on an annual basis, just do a 30-minute session on state of, e-bikes, micromobility, and state of public safety encampments. That is, those two things probably the most are the biggest issues I think that we're going to have.
Yeah, I mean, this is such an evolving space, Michael. You're exactly right. And of course, Fort Collins is not many parts of the Bay Area. And so, as we're getting more, as more research is being done, UC Berkeley ITS has a fantastic work. They're doing some work in the micromobility space. Susan Shaheen particularly has been, a leader here. We do work also with Portland State and looking at, some of these more urban, suburban environments that can provide better guidance. So it's an evolving space, and I think it's a great idea to continue to have these conversations.
Doug, I had a question about, thank you for the resources that you mentioned, the next generation trails and the design for small things with wheels. Is there any jurisdiction that you'd point to that has like some policies or some best management practices that they've adopted that might be leading the way, if you will, for the rest of us who are evolving on this topic? And do you have any suggestions for developing some guidelines, and besides with the resources that you already suggested, in terms of some policies or some more formality for a jurisdiction that's got these types of issues to deal with?
Sure. I mean, Atlanta has been a leader in this, in figuring out how to manage the Beltline. So they're one opportunity. I'm trying to think within California if we're seeing any really good policies. I'll have to talk to some of my colleagues and I can follow up and looking at, some of the folks. We're working with many cities. We recently wrote some policies for Redwood City that help look at some of these issues. I can follow up with some other examples.
That'd be very much appreciated. Thank you.
Sure.
I don't have a question, but I also just want to, before we finish up, just plug a save the date that went out yesterday from Caltrans and CTC for the Active Transportation Resource Center Symposium. It's a year off, but they sent the save the date yesterday. And since you're all into continuing education and continuing to learn about everything active transportation, might want to check it out. For those of you who are, I think everyone else is in NorCal besides Doug. So I'll drop a link to that in the chat. And yeah, just wanted to plug that real quick. Bet there'll be something on micromobility.
Great. Thank you, Jesse. Sam, I saw your hand up. Did you have a question?
No, that was me. You already answered my question about
great.
Policies and jurisdiction.
Yes.
Okay, well, I think that seems like it's it. Thank you so much, Doug, for the presentation, and thanks everyone for the good questions and for coming today. I will be posting this to our YouTube channel, and I'll send that link out in an email to everyone.
Thank you for the opportunity. And yeah, I mean, Alta Planning is, we're a leader in the space and are happy to have ongoing conversations with, any jurisdictions or, organizations that are looking to really think through how to manage micromobility on trails or in spaces. Obviously, we have trails that are intersecting as part of networks with streets as well, and we do quite a bit of work in that space. Thank you again for the opportunity.